Yeah.
As I'll ever be. Come on.
Perfect. Well, morning everyone. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds even, just for everyone to join, and then we'll begin our webinar today. Okay, cool. I think we're all good to start. So morning everyone. Welcome to today's webinar where we'll be going through Windows 365 and AVD. We're joined today by myself and Tony Cox. So just a bit about me. So Ricky Patel, one of the pre-sales leads at PowerON, coming from more of a technical background in the past in the world of things like Config Manager and Intune. But over the past 2 years or so now, transitioned to more of a pre-sales role. But that's a bit about me. We're joined by Tony. Tony, if you just want to do a quick intro.
Morning all. Yes, my name's Tony Cox. I'm what they call a Cloud Endpoint Technical Specialist. I focus on all things endpoint and management through Intune. So again, similar sort of role to Ricky, but obviously at Microsoft, and I am also in a pre-sales role as well.
Cool. So as part of today's agenda, what we're going to be talking about is a quick overview on Windows 365 and AVD, some of the use cases and how some of these technologies align, as well as some of the recent improvements and developments that Microsoft are making within this space, and then opening up to some questions and answers. But based on that, feel free to submit any questions during the chat, and then we'll go through them later in this session. But just a quick recap, really. So when lots of organizations are talking about modern desktop strategies, it's more focused towards how are we going to provide resources and applications to our end users. And more traditionally, that may have been through more physical devices, so various pieces of hardware having to be, say, managed from both a software and hardware perspective to allow users such as information workers, power users, contractors, and other users within the environment with the ability to, say, access resources. Over the past few years now, Microsoft have massively developed in the space of modern VDI when it comes to things like AVD and Windows 365, providing organizations with additional functionality and options to be able to support their end users. From a support perspective as well, the intention behind a lot of these things is mainly to reduce the amount of effort that's required, ensure that no matter if the device is, say, physical or virtual, it's easy to patch and manage, ensuring that you're moving from one version of Windows to the next, and adding in the security controls to ensure that the operating system is secure and then being able to make data-driven decisions. So Tony, from your side of things, how's things looking from your side when it comes to these types of conversations?
Well, these kinds of conversations tend to arise when customers are looking at, for example, moving away from Citrix. Maybe they've got a large on-prem Citrix estate, and they're looking at moving that into the cloud. We've also seen a lot of customers who are looking at maybe moving some of their users that are currently using AVD onto Win365 because of the persistent desktop model. So there's a number of ways organizations are coming at this, but it tends at the moment to be, I'm using a traditional virtualized environment, I'm managing a whole virtualization stack, and how do they move that model to the cloud, and also as well reduce their, I guess, dependence on having qualified people to manage that virtualization stack, because those skills are rare and increasingly more expensive.
Yeah, I guess that leads really well on to the next slide, really. So when it comes to kind of just giving you more context, really, as to from a traditional device perspective, a lot of the traditional devices and hardware tend to be more corporately managed, with the efforts towards things like device lifecycle, which can be potentially quite expensive and time consuming to, say, provision devices or being able to, say, get the hardware that's required. But we understand that maybe modern VDI isn't for everyone yet. And so within the Intune space, the functionality will continue to grow in order to support, say, all different scenarios. So similar to what Tony was just saying there, from a support perspective and the skills required, Windows 365 is more of a subscription-based license, allowing for a lot of maybe the back end to be facilitated by Microsoft, allowing from IT teams to have a more of a simplified management of their devices, allowing them to manage their device in the same way that they would for a physical device. This would be more of a software as a service, but I think one of the main differing factors, right, Tony, is that Windows 365 is more of a one-to-one mapping. So a user would be assigned a license, if I'm correct in saying, and then there'll be, a Windows 365 Cloud PC would be provisioned. Spot
on, Ricky. So the whole model here, when we compare it to things like AVD, for example, is that it's a one-to-one license, a one cloud PC to one user. So you can imagine that if you're looking at, for example, persistent desktops, you want to provide a persistent stream desktop to an end user because maybe you want to stretch the life of some hardware, or you may have a BYOD policy and people can bring their own device, and you want to still give them a fully corporate managed desktop. Then Windows 365 allows you to facilitate that by having that kind of one-to-one mapping. So one user to one license. The exception to that is when we talk about it a bit later on, is the new frontline model, but I don't want to give too much away yet. So yes, it's a one-to-one mapping. It's a subscription-based license as opposed to AVD, which is a consumption-based license.
Yeah, got you. So I guess one of the big things there is it's not kind of dependent on utilization when it comes to 365, whereas maybe for the AVD side of things, like you just mentioned there, it's a consumption-based license. I think that goes into some of the skill set kind of conversations that we were having earlier on in regards to AVD and some of the skills that are required from maybe an Azure perspective, as it can be quite complex in the back end, maybe managing some of the host pools and the networking components that come with it. But I guess some of the really good benefits for AVD too is being able to just issue out some of the applications out to your end users, or giving the ability for multi-sessions, and maybe not always for organizations that are requiring a persistent desktop. So maybe just the ad hoc, being able to log in from home, check upon a couple of systems, or log into certain applications and then log off, rather than having that using it for 8 hours a day type of scenario. But when it comes to the management of some of these solutions, and like you guys can probably see on the screen, when some of these solutions were maybe more on-premise, it did involve a lot more to look after, especially when it came to things like physical data centers, the networking, and the host pools too, and then the additional items that come with that. So making sure maybe DRs in place for maybe multi-sites and data centers, and maybe the cost of ensuring that the power was always on if there was a power cut, for example. But like you see, over time, as you move towards more of the PaaS and the SaaS solutions, the amount that IT has to look after is reduced and maybe diverted into different areas. So maybe concentrating more towards the deployment configuration and how secure both the identity and the actual devices, maybe the operating system. So across maybe AVD, like I mentioned on the previous slide, there is maybe more to look after, but does very much help in more of those more complex scenarios, giving you more granular control. However, for Windows 365, it's more of a base image, allowing you to layer on various configurations from Intune, making it a very similar experience to how you would manage your physical devices today. But Tony, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think you've covered it pretty well, actually, Ricky. This diagram really nails home the fact that what we're talking about here is software as a service. So you purchase, configure, and deliver a cloud PC in the form of Windows 365 in pretty much the same way you would today with a Microsoft 365 license. So this idea that you don't have to manage any of that underlying virtualization infrastructure, and it's all managed through Intune. So for 99% of all the management scenarios you're going to want to, or maybe you may approach or may touch on, you treat the cloud PC in exactly the same way as the physical PC. So once you've set the cloud PC up, things like, you want to do conditional access policies, or you would want to deliver applications, and you want to deliver all of the different things you can do in Intune, that applies to both the physical PC and the cloud PC. So this idea of it being software as a service, so you don't have to manage any of that underlying infrastructure. Just kind of plays into that simplicity story. You create a configuration policy, you decide how you wanted to connect it to the network and the outside world, and what kind of compute power you want to give somebody, and you just drop that into a configuration policy, and within 10-15 minutes you've got a cloud PC. So it's easy to roll out lots of these to large numbers of users in an afternoon, for example.
Okay, yeah, no, great. I guess the next couple of slides really goes into some of the use cases and how maybe these technologies align, because I think we're right in saying that Windows 365 doesn't apply to all use cases, and AVD could apply to some of the others. So based on some of the conversations you've been having with your clients at Microsoft, how does, say, some of these hybrid working scenarios apply based on, say, different use case scenarios?
I guess there are kind of two key areas that we've seen lots of conversations and some uptake around Windows 365. The most obvious one is what you term the contingent workforce. You bring in a number of contractors for maybe a couple of months, maybe 6 months. And historically, what the organization would have done, and you probably all have experience of doing this, is you would have had to find those people, quite often a physical PC, if you wanted to give them a fully managed corporate desktop and treat them in the same way you would a normal employee. Yep. At the end of that contract, you would have then asked for the to get the PC back, and then crossed your fingers that the PC would have come back, and had come back in a state that you could recycle and then reuse and then give to somebody else. So it was all a bit about, there was all that cost involved in that logistics chain as well. So Windows 365 is a great way to say to people, right, okay, you're going to come and join us for 7 months to work on a particular project. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a fully corporate managed desktop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow you to stream that to any device. So it doesn't matter whether it's Mac OS, iOS, Android, we really don't care. Of course, obviously we prefer to use Windows, but we tend to be a much more of a kind of digital Switzerland when it comes to this sort of thing. And so this ability to then stream that to the device, and at the end of the contract or that piece of work, simply take that license away from that end user, recycle that license, and then move it onto maybe another user on another project. And none of that data that's streamed through that cloud PC ever touches the local device. So you can do the whole bunch of policies to stop data leaking out and all of those sorts of things, disabling various things. So there's kind of like a proper wall, if you like, between your corporate environment and the local BYOD PC. So what that kind of leads into is, of course, we see some organizations looking at Windows 365 because they want to drive a BYOD policy. Yeah.
And I guess from what you were saying there as to the data is, say, being streamed to the device, I assume that means a lot of the hardware in maybe the coming years may have, say, reduced compute. So we don't need so much compute power from our actual physical devices because a lot of the content is kind of, the compute power is coming from elsewhere.
Absolutely. So I guess there's a number of scenarios, and we'll talk a little bit about this, about some of the kind of sustainability and total economic impact stuff. So we see scenarios where organizations are looking at extending the life of their existing hardware. And what a cloud PC allows you to do is you don't have to worry so much about what the local compute is. And so therefore we're seeing plans being drawn up. We've seen some announcements from LG, which we'll mention in a second, for example, of this ability to say to a device, okay, I'm going to remove as much compute power locally from the device because I don't need it locally anymore, and move that all into the cloud. So it means we can have very lightweight, but really nice devices that have a much longer extended life. So we can see, and we've seen this in some of the analysis that's been going on, maybe extending a device to 8 years, maybe further, for example. Really nice screen, really great keyboard, almost no local compute power at all. And as we were talking before we started on, Ricky, we started talking about this, is that the thing that limits most local hardware is the compute itself after a period of time becomes aged. And of course, if you don't have any of that local compute power, because everything's coming out the cloud, the device itself can be really high quality and not worry about the internal processor and all of that sort of stuff, not keeping up with the latest technology trends and advances that we see.
Yeah, that's very similar to some of the conversations that we're having at PowerON too. Some of the clients that we're speaking to, maybe just short-term contractors, not want to say provide a physical device out to them. And it's just made it really easy for a lot of our clients being able to say just assign a license to that contractor, applying the same policies that they would as if it was a physical device, and then for them to have the same experience but within a say a secure container. Yeah, so definitely conversations like that, more towards things like maternity cover in some cases based on recent conversations, auditors as well, so maybe third-party organizations having access in, so we have to say lock down a Windows 365 device, allowing them to maybe just access certain components of the organization but not everything, as things outside of the operating system, being able to say secure the identity things still apply, and whether it's physical or virtual.
There are two others actually, Ricky, which we're beginning to see as well. One is developers. So we've seen a lot of uptake in developer environments. So of course, traditionally, you got to give the developer a large Steam-powered laptop that could that was semi-sentient. Now you don't have to do that. You could simply give the users a kind of high-end cloud PC to do their development work on, and then use something like the upcoming DevBox scenario if you wanted to then run that code in the cloud. So it's kind of changing the dynamic of the way developers might access content and those sorts of things. And let's not forget, and we can kind of talk about this as well, is that our own internal use of cloud PCs. So our consumer business, all the consumer help desks around the globe, all use Windows 365 currently. So you can imagine that in a scenario where users are maybe going 24/7 round the sun type stuff, 24/7 follow the sun type scenarios for support centers and those sorts of things, we're seeing interest in Windows 365 in those environments as well.
Yeah, and yeah, I guess another one as well, right, is like a desktop DR type of scenario. So in the scenario that my physical device has maybe a hardware issue and I'm able to use it, whilst maybe PowerON is kind of going through the process of issuing me maybe a replacement device or getting an engineer out to say repair it. It could be maybe assigned a Windows 365 license, allowing me to say access all my corporate resources and applications from a personal device or a tablet or something along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess what this emphasizes is that whilst there is obviously a bunch of technical nuance around not managing the virtualization stack and all of those sorts of things, and whether or not you want to give people persistent desktops or a pooled desktop, this is really not a technology decision. It's much more of a use case decision. So when somebody says, do I use Windows 365 or AVD, for example, to provide a streamed desktop to my end users, the question is, what's the use case? And if the use case is this person is going to be using this cloud PC for more than 3 or 4 hours a day, then that sits inside, from an economic point of view and from a licensing point of view, that sits really well with Windows 365. If they says, no, I've got 20 people and I want to give them pooled desktops and they're going to be using it for maybe an hour a day, a couple of hours a day, I don't want to do any customization, I just want to give them the generic desktop, and then the next time they log in, whatever changes they've made, they get that generic desktop again, then that's a pooled desktop, and that sits really well with AVD. So again, it's really about the use case.
Yeah, and we're really seeing a lot of conversations as to being a blend of both. So exactly meeting some of those use cases that you've mentioned there. Organizations maybe having an AVD environment as well as having, say, the licenses to provide things like desktop DR or to meet some of those bring your own PC requirements. So yeah, I think it isn't so much of it's one or the other. It's definitely which solution kind of meets which use case.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think based on those, I think there's been a lot of conversations between ourselves, some of the clients that we were having conversations with, as to who's already using it, what they're trying to achieve, depending on some of their different use cases, and then maybe what it looks like from some of the journey types of things as well. So I think we've gone into some of these already, but I don't know what your thoughts were based on some of the conversations you've had, based on recent case studies that you've had.
Yeah, so I think what the danger sometimes is to get into a conversation about AVD versus something else or versus Windows 365, and that really hasn't been our experience at all. It's generally been an and/or conversation. So to emphasize the point I made earlier on, what's the use case, and then that's kind of led the conversation with the customer about where which direction they'll go in, whether they go in the
Very
Windows 365
similar.
direction or whether they go in the AVD direction. And to that point, you mentioned it here. What's the persona of the user? What's the kind of work profile? What are the kind of things they're accessing, for example? And then this has led into other conversations, like what does their Microsoft estate currently look like today? Are you using Intune, for example, as your primary UEM to manage devices? Because of course, Windows 365, because it's all policy driven, and Intune is really all about policies. It's all driven from Intune, and we've seen some customers use this as an option or an opportunity to do much more with Intune for other things, or with their physical PCs, if they, for example, have an estate which has been largely managed through SCCM, for example, and they're looking about moving that into the cloud. So how do you go? What's the kind of journey you go on? And they're using Windows 365 as a way of jump-starting that journey for the users who they traditionally would have maybe had a Citrix environment for.
Yeah, so we see it in a building block kind of process and journey as well. So lots of organizations that we've spoken to recently too, on the whole conversations about modern management and what that journey looks like, and maybe carrying out some of those transitions, maybe away from things like Config Manager into Intune, as to implementing some of the packages that we do at PowerON, but as well as the policies, all the policies that are, say, created or imported from like group policies, can then be applied to Windows 365 as well. So it's not that a separate set of policies have to be created for Windows 365. The same policies that are applied to physical hardware using Intune can also be applied to Windows 365 too. So I guess the management of having to manage different sets of policies doesn't really apply in this case, as I think a lot of organizations try to achieve is the same experience no matter, say, what device you're on. So it doesn't matter that your physical device is there and you've got a virtual one as well, the same experience, the look and the feel, and say restrictions too would look identical.
Absolutely. So we've seen customers across various sectors, particularly when, for example, and not to emphasize this point too much, the organizations either don't want to give users new devices for because they want to extend hardware life, or if the organization has or is embracing BYOD, which of course hybrid work over the last couple of years has engendered about bringing your own device to the organization. And of course this means you can give users, for example, and we've seen organizations do this, give users a stipend to go and purchase their own device, and then provide them with a fully managed corporate desktop through something like Windows 365, for example. So they don't, so that reduces the kind of support burden on the organization, because they don't have to manage the hardware anymore. So, and we've seen this across sector. So the use case which you'll find amongst others on the Microsoft website is Grant Thornton, and Grant Thornton used a combination of both Windows 365 and AVD. Back to the original point around what's the use case. So they provide both for their end users, depending on what it is as well. So we've seen organizations who have purchased Win 365 because it was the way of being able to get a very difficult application to an end user which would not play well through a standard virtualization stack.
Sure.
I know they couldn't get it to work as a virtual app, so they provided a cloud PC because it worked really, really well through Windows 365.
So moving on to the future of Windows and what's next for remote working. I don't know if, based on some of the points that you were touching on when we're going through the use case scenarios, I don't know if you want to kind of go into some of the stuff that Microsoft's been working on within the PC on TV types of things and frontline work that was recently announced.
It's really interesting because I don't think it's too hyperbolic to say Windows 365 is the future of Windows. So when you'll talk to people at Microsoft or talk to Ricky and his friends at PowerON, when they talk about the future of Windows, we're really talking about Windows 365. So we're on this journey, as you can imagine, to make Windows 365 a hybrid streamed operating system. So it's not too hyperbolic to say it's the future of Windows, hence the reason why it's got most of the webinars that we do and PowerON do will talk about this. And what that means, of course, is that there's a kind of very comprehensive roadmap of new functionality coming to Windows 365 in the near term, and there's lots of discussions about what we're going to be doing in the much longer term. But we've already seen organizations, for example, like LG, talk about embedding Windows 365 as an app, so into a piece of hardware, because of course the app allows you then access directly into your cloud PC. So you may have already seen, I'm kind of talk about this a bit lower down the slide here, that if you go to the Windows Store, you can get the Windows 365 app now, and install that in both Windows 10 and Windows 11. There's on the roadmap and things like Android and Apple iOS and OS X as well for that as well. So that allows you to launch straight into the cloud PC from an app, rather than having to, as you would normally do, go to the RDC client or go to your HTML5 compliant web browser, which you can still do, but we can manage that now through an app too. So that gives us a kind of point of direction that we're going to go around how users access those sorts of things.
Definitely,
but the announcement from LG,
end user experience as well, right? So it's changing the
absolutely,
way people are working.
Yeah, so the LG announcement, which was just been come out, is that if you buy an OLED LG television, a 2023 model, and you go into the browser section or the kind of tabbed application section in there, Windows 365 is an app that you can access directly from your television, and we'll see other manufacturers of other screens also announcing embedded Windows 365 inside their monitors, for example. Which then leads us to this idea that what we begin to see is probably a whole new class of device, which is 365 enabled. So it could really be anything, because the app itself is really, really lightweight. It could turn up in monitors, in keyboards, in mice, in really, really, really nicely designed bits of hardware. We see our Surface friends talking about that already, and we would imagine the other hardware manufacturers would do exactly the same thing as well. We've also seen this idea of small tiny docks, maybe a small block of some kind, which basically has all the different connectors into it, and you basically rock up to anywhere you want to go, plug it in, and have access to your corporate managed desktop that way. And what that means, of course, is that from an innovation point in the short term, we'll see other things to make that a lot easier to do. Things like boot to cloud, for example. So if you have a Windows PC today, this ability to, when the person switches the device on, rather than connecting to the local OS and then going to the cloud PC, will boot directly into the cloud PC. Which means if you've got devices whether you maybe want to extend the life of those, for example, again, give the user that kind of latest OS experience without necessarily having to touch the local hardware in any way. So that kind of makes that kind of booting into the cloud stuff a lot easier. There's other things that which are either coming now or very short. So there's things like bulk resizing. So as you can imagine, one of the things that we do as part of the deployment of a cloud PC, much the same as you would with AVD, for example, is choose the kind of compute power you want to give the user, the amount of memory, the amount of CPUs, and the amount of disk space. What we'll be able to do very shortly is bulk resize those. So if you have a bunch of users who you've configured a particular cloud PC to, and they, through Intune, through analytics, you're seeing that they're getting CPU spikes or it's not very performant, you'll be able to change the size of the cloud PC accordingly, depending on the end user's requirement. What that means as well, if you basically find users have got way too much compute power and you want to kind of size down, you'll be able to do those sorts of things as well. But I think the most significant thing, certainly from a near-term thing, is this new frontline worker model that's come for Windows 365. So one of the things people have asked us is around, if I've got a follow the sun model, do I have to have a license for everybody on all the time? And historically, the answer would have been yes, because you treat it just like a normal license on a cloud, on a physical PC. And what Frontline allows us to do is to say, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a pool of licenses. So everyone's going to have their own personalized desktop. So it doesn't change that model. So everyone still has their own personalized desktop, but there'll be a pooled model which says, for example, I've got 900 people that I want to access a cloud PC, but I only need to buy 300 licenses. And so only at one time, 300 users will be able to access their cloud PCs. And as the sun goes around the planet and people log off, other people in other parts of the world can begin to log in and dip into that pool and take that license out. So there's this ability to basically reduce your licensing footprint, but still give everyone a cloud PC that's persistent and theirs.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, especially when it comes to, I think the one-to-one is although you've got that compute power there and you're only going to be using it for maybe 8 hours a day, this is a kind of another way of maximizing on how much you're paying for. So I think having that follow the sun, so being able to say consume 8 hours for me to log off and then for sort of somebody else to log back in to use that same compute power makes a big difference, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
The next couple of slides is mainly about sustainability and simplicity. And we talk about things like environmental impact and kind of what that is doing based on having to look after maybe hardware. The way that this is looking to work is being able to say extend device life cycles by up to 100% and being able to maybe reduce the cost of hardware as the compute power is being shifted towards more of the cloud, making it, I guess, easier to when it comes to onboarding and the whole device deployment side of things, as when it comes to being able to well, issue out a user with Windows 365, it's the matter of just assigning a license and then they would get the pop them across the link and they'll just log in as they would be able to say load up their cloud PC on a web browser or through the apps that Tony mentioned. But I guess from a logistical perspective as well, it's the whole cutting down on the cost and the emissions and the wastage that comes with the packaging and the material that comes with when you purchase a new device, and equally maybe from a shipping perspective as well. But I think, Tony, the next one may be really good from an economic impact and kind of where we're seeing things shift in this direction.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one. There's and I guess as part of this whole webinar process that we'll send you the documentation. So there's two interesting reports. One which is kind of linked to the previous slide. So there's a research organization called PX3 who've done a whole bunch of analysis of side-by-side compute usage between a physical PC and a Windows 365 PC to kind of understand the sort of power requirements and the sorts of scope 3 emission type of things as well. So as you probably understand from a environmental sustainability point of view, you have scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are around that downstream part of the business, which is really hard for organizations to manage, and it's also the larger part of that whole greenhouse gas emission energy consumption type analysis that organizations are having. So we're happy to share the PX3 report with you. And what's really interesting about that, so one little nugget which comes out of that for me, is that if you have two identical machines, one's running a physical operating system and its normal application environment as you would normally see, you have exactly the same device running that operating system, but also then accessing a cloud PC, because most of the compute regards things like running applications is offset into the cloud. The power usage of the local device is reduced, so you get less power usage on a machine running a cloud PC, even though the underlying operating system is absolutely identical. And to give you an example, so a colleague of mine is currently having his house completely rejigged at the moment, and of course he can't often get to PowerPoints to get the kind of battery life of his device up and running. So what he's done is he's running a cloud PC on his physical desktop, because he knows he can get more life out of the battery. Wow. To just give him times between plugging in. Now that sounds like a trivial, maybe a kind of trivial part of it, but it gives a kind of, like, for me, it gives a kind of real world example of things like, how do I extend battery life, which means how am I reducing the power usage of that local device, and therefore if the device is using less power, then it's having a smaller environmental impact. And then from an economic point of view, and again, this is back to that kind of use case thing, particularly around what you're doing with your hardware. So there's kind of two things. I guess there's two things to this. One is obviously management of that environment, because you're not having people managing any of that in virtualization infrastructure. You're just all managing it through Intune. All of your people who would normally be managing all of that hardware, for example, they could go and do something more useful in the organization. And also as well, from a hardware perspective, we've alluded to it earlier on, we really hear about is extending the life of hardware or changing the hardware dynamic. So if you're thinking to yourself, actually, I'm on a 3 to 5 year device recycle or refresh cycle, what I can do now is maybe I can extend that to 8, for example, if I can then say, for example, in the latter part of the life of that device, or even earlier on, if needs be, let's move the desktop into the cloud, which means I can keep a device for an awfully lot longer than I would normally do, and so therefore reduce that kind of total cost of ownership of the whole desktop infrastructure significantly. And then later on as well, once I do begin to refresh those devices, I don't have to buy either such high-powered devices anymore. I don't have to buy devices that are going to chase the technology. I can simply give people a really great user experience in a really great device, but with much reduced or almost no local compute at all. So again, and of course, the cost point of those devices is also going to be significantly lower.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that too, because I think today when you're moving from, say, one version of Windows to the next, there could be things like hardware requirements as to the device needs to be a certain spec, whereas and equally with a certain spec comes a certain price too. So especially when you're offloading a lot of it to the cloud, reduces, say, the amount of compute power the device needs, especially with some of the other items that you mentioned in earlier slides about boot to cloud. So yeah, definitely sounds like it's going to extend device life cycles significantly. I think we're at the end of our slides now. I think we're on to some of the questions and answers type of stage. So I think we've got some questions in here, Tony, in regards to are we able to differentiate role profiles between device and Windows 365's environment? So from what I quickly had a quick look at in regards to this, then from my understanding anyway, there is the ability to use things like conditional access to differentiate who has access to what. So based on maybe if you want to access more of the admin access, so maybe Azure portals and things like that, maybe you could apply some of the conditional access policies, ensuring that you could only access those pages if you're on, say, Windows 365 rather than on your physical device. But I don't know, Tony, if you've got any thoughts on that one.
No, I think you've covered that pretty well, mate. I think that when we look at Windows 365, for example, what we're really, again, and I'm sorry to sound a little bit like a stuck record, we're really talking about that kind of use case piece. So I think you covered that really, really well, mate.
Sure. We've got another question in here is how is AVD different from Citrix Desktop, and what are the benefits, pros and cons from one another? I think we actually have some context in regards to that, which we can more than happily share as part of the slides after this webinar. But I guess some of the main things is AVD is cloud-based, so your host pools and some of the networking factors, as well as some of the compute, all the compute power will come from your Azure environment. Maybe from a Citrix perspective, you do need to have maybe that on-premise physical appliances in place in order to, say, deliver the same, which then could naturally come at an increased cost as you're having to maybe maintain hardware as well. We've got another one here. So how to compare costs outside of licensing, for example, BAU for AVD versus Windows 365, changes business requirements and speed of deployment. So I don't know if you want to go into that one.
No, yes, of course, mate. I think what's really important here, and Ricky's already mentioned it already, that the speed of deployment, for example, for Windows 365 means that you can deploy literally thousands of cloud PCs after a couple of clicks in Intune, as long as you've got the licenses. So you allocate the license to the user in your Microsoft 365 Admin Center as you would with any other license, because it's licensed the same way on a per user per month basis as your Microsoft 365 licenses. Allocate the licenses to the end user, go into Intune, choose how you're going to connect to your network, and that could be, for example, just using the Microsoft hosted network, or using your Azure network to provide ingress and egress into your organization. You then simply choose what kind of compute power you want, and then from the group-based policies that you've got in place, you simply choose which users get a cloud PC, and you can give those users cloud PCs in an afternoon. So for the speed of deployment and getting those users up and running is extraordinarily quickly. Quickly. I don't use an adjective at that point. So extraordinarily quick. So
Yeah.
so that's just that kind of like cost of administration that's significantly lower because you can give people stuff really, really fast. And then there's that, and again, that, and I think we discussed this a little bit earlier. Obviously, every organization is different. So the kinds of ongoing ROI through their kind of how their BAU is running is going to be very specific to other organizations. And of course, that's the reason why having people like you around, Ricky, is really, really helpful, because you can get into those deep discussions with a customer about, you know, how Windows 365 would fit their organization based on their current structure.
Sure. We've got another question here in regards to, I think it's more related to AVD. So kind of which do you recommend out of app attach and Intune for app delivery? So the way that PowerON manages AVD for lots of organizations is using actually Azure Image Builder. So when the images are actually produced, we use code to ensure that certain applications are embedded into that image at a refresh stage. So rather than using app attach, which is maybe more MSIX based, we opt for Azure Image Builder instead. However, out of maybe app attach and Intune for app delivery, I would recommend the Intune for app delivery personally. For the next questions, we have we're on the shared tenant within the NHS. I would be interested if this model, if we could look to implement this model in the future. It's definitely something that we can pick up on. So me and Tony are having conversations with NHS Digital about a few other things within the model management space. But it's definitely something that we can highlight to them to see if there is functionality on their roadmaps as to if they're looking to enable the functionality for things like Windows 365 and maybe some of the options that could come with that too. We have what factors would cause an organization to pick AVD over Windows 365? I think for this, similar to what we were going through in today's slides, is it depends on the use case scenarios. So based on some of the scenarios that Tony was playing now and myself, it differs depending on who it is and kind of what they're using it for, rather than how large or small an organization is, based on, say, which technology to use.
It's interesting. There's another interesting point there, Ricky, as well. So I think in the middle of that question is the word automation. And we've seen organizations build automated front ends for deploying cloud PCs, so integrating it into HR systems. So someone joins an organization, you can have a form where you say, does that user require a physical PC or a cloud PC? They say you use a cloud PC, you choose the spec of the cloud PC you want to give the user. That then drops their name into a group in Intune, which basically then drops them into the relevant policy. And because the policy is always there, as soon as a new user drops into the group, they get a cloud PC generated. So you can onboard people really, really quickly. And at the same time, and that's all been developed. You can do that with things like Power BI, for example. I've seen people use even SharePoint lists backed up with some PowerShell scripts and some Power BI to go and do that. And then on the other end of that, when a user maybe leaves the organization, again, have that same automated offboarding process. So it then removes the license from the user. They then go into the grace period in Intune, which gives administrators the opportunity to maybe do some remedial work with the cloud PC to get data out of it, for example. And then secondly, at that point, if they want to accelerate the grace period and then recycle that license straight away.
Yeah, I think we've done some recent work internally as well in regards to utilizing Microsoft Forms for that exact use. So having the forms for the status process, and it'll automatically assign a license to that specific user, and then start the provisioning process, and then equally for that leavers process too. Final couple of questions we've got here is how to make an existing Windows PC act as an invisible thin client for Windows 365 or AVD. Remote desktop client always requires extra clicks to sign in, and then to pick whether it's pick one cloud PC. So I think some of the work and the developments that Tony, you were mentioning earlier, especially for boot to cloud, could definitely maybe help in those scenarios as to maybe just thin, empty clients and just booting straight into the cloud and the cloud PC itself, rather than having to go through the other clicks to say jump through and to then eventually launch your cloud PC?
Absolutely. So boot to cloud is going to reduce the amount of clicks. Also, we recommend that you use the app as well. So if you have a Windows PC running either Windows 10 or Windows 11, and you want to be able to access your cloud PC, just simply use the app. So fire up the app and then click on the cloud PC you want, and then you can be logged straight in. There's some other things coming as well. Things like the ability to dock it as part of the different window profiles that you can do in Windows. So you can be in your physical desktop and then just switch the cloud PC in the alternative desktop mode, for example. So there's docking, there's the app, so there's there are a number of things that are being worked on either directly or available today that reduces the number of clicks to allow you to get into your cloud PC. But you can imagine that as we kind of go to the things we talked about earlier on about Windows 365 being embedded in devices, the amount of clicks that users will have to do to get into their corporate environment is going to shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink.
Okay, we've got one here which is a bit more technical, I guess. So it says, does it use FS logic for user profile management, and where does it store the user profile with non-persistent desktops?
Because oh god, sorry, Ricky.
No, I was just going to say,
your question, not mine.
No. I was going to say, from a Windows 365 side of things, I would assume it's stored within that PC as it is a persistent desktop, rather than maybe an AVD, which is not. So from my understanding, I think AVD does use FS logic to store the profiles, whereas the data stored within Windows 365 would be on the actual virtual machine that's spun up as part of it. But feel free to correct me where I'm wrong, Tony.
No, you're absolutely bang on, because you're not managing any of that kind of virtualization infrastructure at all. So you're not having to manage FX Logic's profiles or any other that. It's treated as just like a physical desktop. So the identity stored in Azure Active Directory can be hybrid if you want to, but Azure Active Directory, and it's stored just in the same way that we store identities and manage those user profiles with physical PC. So it's all managed through Intune.
Sure. Last question. So we've got, can one user have more than one Windows 365 PC with different user credentials?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because what we're doing is we're allocating a license to an identity. So if you've got multiple cloud PCs with multiple identities attached to them, they'll just have licenses attached to them, just as they would under normal circumstances in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So the answer to that is yes.
Okay. I think that is the final question. So just some useful kind of information to take away from today's session. We'll be doing some more in regards to maybe demos and links that'll be sent out with the webinars. But check out our previous blogs and some of the stuff we've done previously. If you want to have some more conversations in regards to a bit more about some of the slides, or some conversations in regards to how this can align to your organization, then feel free to pop us an email. We'll be sending out the recording from today's session. And then if you want to see more of me, you're in luck, because we'll be doing more webinars similar to these. But yeah, really, thank you for joining. We'll try and send the webinars out within the next 24 hours. Feel free to share them internally. But thank you for joining.
Thank you, everybody.